I'm William Sayers. My friends call me Chip. I had a career in various three-letter agencies in Washington, doing intel mostly in support of the Pentagon. I retired a few years ago. I also went to all the Marine Corps' professional military education schools. I'm wearing my McWar shirt here. So who could not want to go to a school called McWar? But this is the thesis that I did for the very first one, Marine Corps Command and Staff College, which was over 20 years ago. So a little dated, but I think that we can work with this. So let's just launch into it. All right, so in 1990, I was assigned to an office at Defense Intelligence Agency, where our charter was to look at the world through the eyes of the Soviet General Staff. That meant that we would be looking a lot at the Soviet correlation of forces methodology, but I felt like we didn't understand it well enough at that time. In particular, we needed something to develop our own scores so that we could keep up with what was going on out there and explore possibilities for the future. Also, we did not have their K factors. These are the operational circumstances of the battle. So, for instance, we didn't have anything to modify force strength for terrain, for posture, for troop quality, etc. So I went casting about for something that could fill in those gaps for us. And I decided that Colonel Dupuy's model would best fit the bill. In particular, I felt like that he had developed his modeling using military history similar to the way the Soviets looked at it. And I thought that it would make a good fit, and it did. We contracted with this company and received the model and training during the summer of 1990, which just so happened to be right before Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait. And so we had a real world situation to check this out on. I did feel that we needed something a little bit quicker and faster than the model itself. I mean, it is quick, but I didn't have the experience on it, and I wanted something that I could just do with a pencil and a piece of paper and a hand calculator. And so I looked into the technique that he had used in his books, The Options of Command and Understanding War, where he cut it down to very, very basic formulae. And we'll take a look at that. And those are the books that inspired this. And also on the right, you see a Sandhurst book that was produced after some of the talks that our folks had with the Soviets during the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty negotiations, where they kind of showed us a lot more than we ever expected to see on correlation of forces, but they were also trying to pull the wool over our eyes by not exactly telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth as to what the scores were and things like that. But it made a really excellent basis for this thesis, so I'm glad we got it. All right, so it works by building a unit lethality index by taking each of the weapons in the table of organization and equipment of a unit and applying a score to those. And I'll show you this to you in a little more graphic presentation momentarily. You total the ULIs for each side of engagement. You modify those ULIs by the K factors. You take a ratio of the stronger side by the weaker side. And the outcome of the engagement is determined pretty much by the magnitude of advantage. And we're just looking for a that looks about right kind of outcome, not something down to particular casualties or anything. We just want to get a feel for how the battle might go. All right, so I did a lot of work looking at the Brits in the Falklands, and this is a tabulation that I did for the thesis. So, for example, 2nd Para Battalion had 349 L1A1 rifles in it. Each one had an operational lethality index of 0.06. So the total for that category of weapon was 20.94. And as you see, we just add those up, and down at the bottom, you get a unit lethality index of 1521. Now, I'd like to point out that the L16 81 millimeter mortars, there are 8 of them in their TO&E. They didn't take all of them to Goose Green with them, and we'll be looking at that in a moment. All right, so this is how we add in other things. You notice that under 2 para, I'm actually subtracting out 6 mortars. They were going to be hiking into battle across some pretty good terrain, and they decided that carrying all the ammunition that goes with an 81 millimeter mortar wouldn't be worth it. So they left 6 of them behind. And so I had to take out that score for them. Also, their doctrine at the time was to have 1 battery of artillery supporting a battalion of infantry. In this case, the commando brigade did not give them a full battery. They just gave them 3 guns. And so I scored those individually and put them in here. HMS Ardent had a single 4.5 inch naval gun, and she was thrown into that battle. And if you look at the Harrier sorties, at the crucial moment, they got 3 Harriers in there equipped with cluster bombs. And if you look at the score, it's pretty impressive. It basically equals the entire rest of the battalion. This is largely because an aircraft dumps all its munitions at once and flies off, and that can have a pretty devastating psychological impact beyond just the destruction it causes. So in the end, the Brits were bringing 3,409 points to the battle. The 12th Mechanized Infantry Regiment on the Argentine side had a big minus there. That's because they actually flew into the Falklands and only took the weapons they could carry on the airplane with them. Their heavy weapons were going to be coming across by ship, and that ship never arrived. So they were very light on supporting weapons. If you notice, they also had 305 millimeter guns, but what they didn't have were radios. They had 2, they lost 1 right up front at the beginning of the battle. So what good is that going to do anybody? They could tell headquarters what was going on, but they couldn't really direct the guns. So that was a big handicap for them. They also only had, I believe, 3 mortars and none of the other heavy support weapons that they would have expected to have. What they did have was a fair amount of anti-aircraft artillery. So that was pretty scary. In the end, it didn't have much effect on the battle, but that was something that the Brits really had to be concerned about, with the Argentines possibly using that in a ground-to-ground role. So if you look, you have 1775 on the Argentine side. That's basically about a 2-to-1. However, let's put in the K factors. We chose 3 K factors to use. Posture, the Argentines get a 1.5 for being in a prepared defense. That's generous, calling what they had prepared. The terrain was rolling but bare, and that's worth a 1.2. And then combat effectiveness value, CEV, is the quality of the troops and the officers and other intangibles like that. The Argentines many of them were barely out of basic training, had no unit tactical training. On the other side, the 2 Para was considered to be a fairly elite unit in the British Army. So you multiply the two sides by the respective K factors and you get a 1.6 to 1. The numbers at the bottom of this slide are, thumbnail numbers, but basically you would expect a 1.6 to 1 to lead to a very slow moving, high casualty battle. And in fact, it took more than 24 hours to resolve this thing. And it was very close run. But the Brits did eventually prevail. And look, there we go. Okay. This slide is really busy. I put it up to show you that, this comes directly from Soviet sources. What we're really concerned with here is just the upper right-hand quadrant. The x-axis is correlation of forces. The y-axis is kilometers per day that the Soviets thought that they would make at a given correlation of force. If you look closely, you can see that up to about 1.5 to 1, they didn't expect to see much movement at all of the line of contact. Recall that we're dealing with a 1.6 to 1 at Goose Green. Let's see, what is it, 3.4 to 1, they're all the way up to 40 kilometers a day, 4.25 to 1, 60 kilometers, and so on, 5 to 1, 77 kilometers per day. Now, they calibrated this largely to their final operation in Manchuria in August 1945, where they were going up a Japanese force that was hollow, had basically no tanks, almost no artillery, very little mobility. I think they made a mistake with that, frankly, and I think that's why that we were always very skeptical of numbers like this. But that was their view, and they thought that they would actually be able to make those mileage per day. But what's really important about this is not exactly how fast and how far you're going to go, but it's the knuckle at 1.5 to 1 and the knuckle at just about 6 to 1. There's a very steep line there, but above 6 to 1, it really flattens out. And essentially, when I do a calculation like this, if you got more than 6 to 1, it's really no battle. It's more like an overrun. If you have 1.5 to 1 or less, then it's probably not going to go well for the attacker. They might be stuck in, but it's not good. But then, if you notice, at 2 to 1, we're not moving very fast. The Soviets looked at that and said, well, okay, we can give up a 2 to 1 in some sectors, let the enemy have twice our combat potential. We'll be okay there so that we can concentrate elsewhere. And this slide is also directly from Soviet numbers. I don't necessarily agree with it completely, but basically the idea is at force ratios close to unity, the attacker's losses are high. And as the attacker gets moving, the defender's losses are high at the bottom end there. And you can imagine the cuirassiers and the hussars running down soldiers. It's that kind of a image that you get when the attacker is going fast. All right, so to deal with Desert Storm, we actually didn't get moving on this as an agency until after the bombing started. So DIA stood up the combat assessments team. I was one of the senior analysts. We had 2 12-hour shifts a day. We were producing a situation map for the White House at the end of each shift. And that was our one customer. And on that situation map, we used this kind of calculation to help assess the relative strength of Iraqi units as we attrited them down. In the meantime, the Army CENTCOM staff was trying to come up with their own version of this sort of calculation, but the Army had none. And so they were trying to throw things together, and we saw probably at least half a dozen or maybe more different ideas of how to do this. And they ranged from the incredibly oversimplistic to the incredibly complex. And the bottom line was nobody could agree, even within the RCENT staff. And it just collapsed in a shambles. And if you can imagine the United States Army on the eve of what could have been a major war, not knowing whether or not they had enough combat power to accomplish the mission. Seems to me like that was a pretty bad oversight on their part. So Commander-in-Chief CENTCOM, General Schwarzkopf, got really frustrated, and he finally said, look, just tell me when we bombed them down to 50% of their combat strength. He wanted to see 50% of their tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and artillery gone. And then he would trip the ground war. Quite frankly, and I think we would all agree that that's not necessary. Historically, 50% attrition is not only unnecessary, but is probably unachievable. And in fact, we didn't get anywhere near that before the ground war started. But that was done really more for political reasons than anything else. And, it just so happens that we had enough force to accomplish what we wanted to. And I can remember very vividly at the end of my shift where the ground war was going to kick off during the next shift, did my calculations, felt very comfortable with the idea that we had enough combat power to do what we were proposing to do. As it happens, the war was over so fast from that point that our efforts probably made little difference at all. Had the war been extended, we might have made a valuable contribution and people might have learned some things. But the Iraqis gave up too darn quick and did not do my career any great favors with that. But anyway, let's move on here. All right, in 1994, if you remember, the Iraqi Republican Guard made a dash for the Kuwaiti border, held up, checked our reaction, and then went home. And we had pre-positioned equipment at Camp Doha in Kuwait City, and we flew in the troops to fall in on that equipment and got them out into the field. But it revealed a problem, and that was if the Republican Guard were allowed to be down close to the border, we might not make it in time if the president hesitated or something. So we instituted a no-drive zone, which was basically complementary to the no-fly zone that we already had there. And the no-drive zone meant that the Republican Guard could not go into that area. And our thought process was that if we could keep them far enough away from the border with Kuwait, we could be assured of getting the troops falling in on the Camp Doha pre-position equipment, and we wouldn't have much of a problem. At this point, I was the Kuwaiti analyst, and I was thinking about it, and the Kuwaiti Army, the Kuwaiti Land Forces is what they refer to them as, were not doing that well. They were kind of in a shambles with different equipment sets, and some units had virtually none, and they weren't fully manned up. And so I was a little concerned that maybe even the regular Army could do the job as weak as they were. So my question was, could the Kuwaiti Land Forces hold off the Iraqis until we got there to save their bacon? And so I did some exploration of that, and what follows is what I looked at. This map shows one of the plans that the Kuwaitis had, where they intended to break up the 6th Mechanized Brigade and have it provide a covering force area at the border. Those guys were not to get heavily engaged, and they were to fall back onto their positions in the main line of resistance. I have Iraqi 3 Corps depicted there, plus the 10th Armored Division from 4 Corps, which I thought might be necessary to reinforce. So that's kind of what it looked like on the ground. And these are the calculations. This is the covering force battle. All we're looking for is the Iraqis to have sufficient force to get the covering force to bolt and get back to their positions on the main line of resistance. The posture of a hasty defense was a 1.2. We're dealing with flat, featureless desert up there, so that's only a 1.5 in favor of the defender. But the interesting part here was what happens if we could get the Kuwaitis trained up and disciplined well enough to get a 50% advantage over the regular Army. The regular Army was not particularly good, so it seemed feasible to do that. However, the Kuwaiti Land Forces at that time had no equivalent to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If a soldier decided he didn't want to train that day, they really didn't have anything they could do to discipline him to make him come to work. And it played havoc with the training on the new equipment sets they were getting. We were equipping some of the brigades with M1s. They were buying, I think it was T-84s from Yugoslavia and BMP-3s from the Russians. And so it was a mishmash, and they really needed a lot of training. But, they were kind of out of luck. I wanted to motivate the Secretary of Defense to look at this from a standpoint of, I don't care what kind of tank you're driving, if you're no good as a soldier, it's not going to do any good. But if you're a good soldier driving maybe an indifferent tank, you can get stuff done still. And so I went through a lot of different combinations of factors, but the 1.5 CEV, I thought, turned out very interestingly. And as you can see, 6th Armored Division there in the center is definitely going to get through. So I figured that this showed that the covering force would have to definitely fall back to the main line of resistance. And the next slide deals with what happens then. Given the CEV advantage that I was speculating for the Kuwaitis, if you notice, the 11th Infantry Division was actually attacking where the Kuwaitis at a 3.1 to 1 advantage. That's not a recipe for success. 6th Armored Division only had a 1.2 to 1 advantage, and the 51st Mech was down at 1 to 2.6 advantage for the Kuwaitis. So in my mind, this tells me that if we could get the Kuwaitis trained up and filled out with good troops, they could hold the line till we got there with our equipment. And I was pretty satisfied with the results. And the last slide in this series just shows the overall situation. And the lesson here is that a 0.9 to 1 is not going to get you there. Now, interestingly enough, at this level, the Soviets had talked about a 1.2 to 1 advantage being good enough, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. All right, so I went to Marine Corps Command and Staff College in 1998-9, and I stayed for their School of Advanced Warfighting, and I believe to this day I'm the only civilian graduate of SAW. And what we spent all our time was learning how to work the planning process to plan battles and campaigns. And it's a very fun school. I enjoyed myself thoroughly, and it was very interesting. But what I did find out was the McPP, as we called it, included, the Marines are great at these things, included wargaming your courses of action, but they gave us no rules or any practical guidance whatsoever how to do that. And I just felt like that was a huge problem, and decided to write my thesis to try to correct that problem. As a group, my conference group got our first planning problem, and things did not go well. They looked at me as the civilian intel guy, and of course I was the G2 for all of our problems. They weren't interested in hearing my opinion about how to fight the battle. Well, our first attempt did not go well, and I debriefed the guys after it was over why I thought that it went poorly. And I used the combat assessment technique basically to prove my point. And it's not that it was obviously ground truth, but it made sense. And it was something that they could grab a hold of. And from that point forward, we always used it and felt pretty satisfied with what we came up with. So it turned out to be very useful. And the simplicity of it was I could come up with the numbers very, very rapidly from pre-generated lists. And it all just made sense. Here's our first planning problem. And I'd just like to point out two interesting things. The first off was that my buddies had the 2nd Marine Division minus with 3 regiments of infantrymen. They did mount them in armored assault vehicle or amphibious assault vehicles, but that's a big thin-skinned target, basically. They had them attacking 3 mechanized brigades frontal assault. I didn't feel good about that, and I didn't feel very good about the fact that they would send their brother Marines off to do that. The other interesting part was that they were using as the reserve for this corps size unit their own tank battalion, the one that they got. So in other words, 2nd Marine Division was going into this battle with no tanks against a mechanized force. And that just didn't look right. So I explained, my problems with it based on the calculations. And it they all just kind of went, oh yeah, okay, I see. So then we redid it. We got a do-over. And if you can see this, it's a little blurry, but basically we put a fixing force on the north here and attacked the other half of the enemy force with overwhelming odds. The Tumardiv came in at a 6.5 to 1 ratio, which basically would indicate they just ran right over the defenders. And First Armored Division, which was part of this task force, had an 8 to 1 advantage, which doesn't even register. That's so high. And everybody looked at this and went, yeah, that's how we should do this from now on. So I felt very vindicated by that. This is a really interesting little exercise, and I used it to illustrate how Red, first off, could win with only a slight advantage, and secondly, how they could utilize this kind of technique to deceive their opponent. And this is a typical NATO core slice out of North Ag of a, shall we say, very weak country's army. And note FEQC is the Soviet equivalent of CEV. It's force effectiveness quality coefficient. So just read that as CEV. It's how good the troops are. Without taking into account terrain, posture, CEV, the Soviets in this scenario have a 2 to 1 advantage. But with the K factors baked in, it's a 1.2 to 1. And I actually manipulated it so that's what I would have to explore what you can do with a 1.2 to 1 advantage. It seems very slight, and people say all the time, oh, you have to have a 3 to 1. Well, not at every level, and this is how that works. So in the beginning, they start their attack, and this is only including the units in contact. It does not include the units in reserve. On the blue left flank, the Soviets are getting a 3 to 1 advantage, which means that they're going to be moving at a decent clip. In the middle, that strike sector is 11 to 1, so they're going to overrun anybody in their road. And then over on the blue right flank, it's only a 2 to 1, which isn't going to involve a whole lot of movement. Now, go ahead. Okay. So note that, the blue commander is not going to have all these numbers and everything. Basically, what he gets is a feel for how bad it is by how fast his guys are retreating. So on the left flank, they're going to be retreating at a pretty good clip. In the center, that's going to look really awful. But on the right, he's not going to feel too bad. So what do? Well, you throw in reserves, right? So basically, he stabilizes the left flank. In fact, he takes the 1.9 to 1 advantage over there. So that's feeling good. On the right flank, it's only a 2 to 1 in Red's favor, but it's not moving very fast at that correlation of forces. So that's not too bad. In the center, it's still a 3 to 1 after he commits that brigade's reserve. So not so good. He's got to do some more work there. And what he does is he commits a brigade to that sector, and that stabilizes everything. And the blue commander is feeling really good about his situation at this point. But he hasn't met the main attack yet, and that comes where he wasn't expecting it. As you can imagine, if 3-1 is a good advance, what's a 22-1? You know, so basically everything along the line gets obliterated. The next battalion back also gets overrun, and suddenly he's got a real problem because he's committed almost all of his reserves. The only thing you can do at this point is throw in that last division in the second echelon. And this is how that develops a little bit further. Then finally, he throws in that division. Now he's got a problem here. If he chooses to make that a meeting engagement, he's in bad shape because it's still going to be a 4.7-1 in favor of red. If he can predict where red's going and he throws down in hasty defense, that helps, but not nearly well enough. It's a 3-1. So any way he goes at this point, he's already lost the battle. NATO has a big gaping smoking hole where an entire corps used to be, and you know, it's off to the races to the Rhine River, right? So I think that this could prove useful for managing the enemy and what he's trying to do. It's simple. It gives you a decent feeling for that sort of thing. All right, so when I graduated from these courses, I gave my thesis and a spreadsheet tool that I had modified and developed to the Marine Air Ground Task Force Staff Training Program. And the MSTP guys later on, I believe this was in like spring of 2001, produced a pamphlet on relative combat power assessment, and they distributed that spreadsheet to the Fleet Marine Force. So I was feeling pretty good about things. And then September 11th rolled around. Suddenly we were dealing in a couple of counterinsurgency campaigns. For the next 2 decades, nobody really cared about this stuff until today. Suddenly, force on force, tanks, aircraft, whatnot, and particularly artillery is kind of the flavor of the month. And so hopefully, having created this once, maybe somebody will remember that at the beginning of their career, they saw something interesting, and maybe we can make use of some of this work. That is pretty much like what I've got for a presentation. There's my email address. I'm happy to answer your questions via email. Also, I'm happy to give you anything on this list that you asked for. I've got this presentation, the thesis itself, that pamphlet and spreadsheet. I also developed some staff officers rules for COA wargaming. It includes an awful lot of data tables and stuff for various stuff. It should be quite handy to anybody who's in that situation. And I have a very, very detailed order of battle for the Falklands War, just so that you have something to apply those rules against if you want to do some experimentation. So at any rate, that's the presentation. I'll leave this screen up in case you want to take down my email, and I guess we can go to questions.